Every security system ever built by human beings rests on a single foundational assumption. The assumption is not about walls. It is not about sensors or guards or cameras or perimeter fencing or biometric access controls or the layered electronic surveillance architecture that a $2 billion military installation deploys across every square meter of its footprint. All of those things exist. All of them work within their design parameters against the threats they were designed to defeat. The assumption is simpler than any of them. The assumption is this: the most dangerous thing that can approach a military base is something large enough to see. A missile, an aircraft, a vehicle, a formation of soldiers, a drone swarm large enough to trigger radar detection, something that announces itself by its size, its speed, its radar signature, or its thermal output, something that the base's sensors were calibrated to find, track, and engage before it reaches the perimeter. Iran just breached a $2 billion American airbase with something that none of those sensors were calibrated to find. Not because the sensors failed, not because the guards were negligent, not because the electronic surveillance architecture had a gap in its coverage, but because the thing Iran sent through the perimeter was designed, from its first engineering drawing, to be invisible to every detection system that American military base security has deployed for the past 40 years. Invisible not in the science fiction sense of a cloaking device. Invisible in the far more dangerous sense of something that looks to every sensor it passes like something that belongs there. At 23:17 local time, Iranian intelligence operatives who had been in position for 11 days breached the perimeter of a $2 billion American air installation in the Middle East, walking through its outer security layer, its secondary sensor ring, its vehicle inspection checkpoint, and its inter-access control system in sequence, carrying equipment that destroyed 3 aircraft, disabled 2 fuel storage facilities, compromised the base's primary communications relay, and exfiltrated targeting intelligence that the Pentagon has described in a classified damage assessment shared with congressional leaders this morning as the most significant single intelligence loss from a U.S. military installation since the 1983 Beirut barracks bombing. They did not fire a missile. They did not launch a drone. They did not crater a runway or seed a submunition denial field. They walked in. And what they did inside that base in 4 hours and 23 minutes has just demonstrated that every security protocol, every sensor array, and every access control system protecting every American military installation on Earth has the same vulnerability, the same one. Every base, one blueprint. Welcome to Geopolitics Meets Money. This is episode 11, and this is the episode where the threat moves inside the wire. To understand how Iran breached a $2 billion American airbase without firing a single shot, you need to understand the 11 days that preceded the breach, because the breach itself, the 4 hours and 23 minutes of movement inside the perimeter, was not the operation. It was the final act of an operation that began nearly 2 weeks earlier and whose sophistication makes every previous Iranian action in this series look blunt by comparison. American military bases in the Middle East do not exist in isolation. They exist inside host nations, countries with local populations, local economies, local labor markets, and local service industries that the bases depend on for everything from construction materials to food supplies to the civilian contractors who maintain the base's non-classified infrastructure. A $2 billion air installation does not employ only American military personnel. It employs hundreds of local nationals, drivers, caterers, maintenance workers, landscapers, laundry service operators, fuel delivery personnel, who pass through its access control systems daily, whose vehicles enter and exit its perimeter on regular schedules, and whose faces, identification documents, and vehicle registrations become familiar to the guards who process them at the entry control points. Familiarity is the vulnerability. Not a technical vulnerability, a human one. The human brain, trained to identify anomalies against a baseline of normal, becomes progressively less sensitive to the baseline itself. A guard who processes the same catering truck through the same checkpoint at the same time every morning for 6 months does not examine the catering truck with the same attention on month 7 as he did on day 1. His brain has categorized it, filed it, moved it from the active threat assessment category to the background noise category. The category of things that have always been there and have never been a problem. Iran's intelligence preparation for the breach began not with the selection of operatives or the procurement of equipment. It began with the mapping of the baseline. 11 days of systematic observation, conducted from positions outside the base perimeter by operatives whose presence in the surrounding area was established through commercial cover identities built over months, produced a complete operational picture of the base's human rhythm. Every vehicle that entered and exited, every contractor who badged through the entry control point, every guard shift rotation, every time the vehicle inspection procedures were abbreviated during high traffic periods when the checkpoint queue backed up and guard commanders made the operationally rational decision to expedite processing to maintain flow. The expedited processing windows, Those were what Iran was mapping. Not the base's defenses at their most rigorous, the base's defenses at their most human. The moments when the system's performance degraded from its design specification to its operational reality, driven by the entirely reasonable decisions of tired guards managing a checkpoint queue at the end of a long shift. Every security system has a gap between its design specification and its operational reality. Iran spent 11 days mapping that gap at a $2 billion American air installation. What it found was not unique to this base. It was structural, universal. The gap between how a security system is designed to function and how it actually functions when operated by human beings under real-world conditions is not a failure of this base's security design. It is a feature of every security system ever built, because every security system is ultimately operated by human beings, and human beings are not machines. At 1840 local time, 4 hours and 37 minutes before the breach team entered the perimeter, a contracted catering vehicle that had been servicing the base's dining facility 3 times weekly for 4 months arrived at its regular delivery window. The vehicle was driven by its regular driver. It carried its regular cargo manifest. It passed through the entry control point on its regular schedule. The guard on duty processed it in 43 seconds, 9 seconds faster than the base's standard vehicle inspection protocol requires, because the checkpoint queue behind the catering vehicle contained 11 additional vehicles, and the guard shift change was in 20 minutes. The catering vehicle was clean. Its driver was the regular driver. Its cargo was genuine catering supplies, but attached to the vehicle's undercarriage, in a magnetic housing designed to survive the speed bumps, the vehicle inspection pit camera sweep, and the undercarriage mirror inspection that the 43-second processing had compressed into a 15-second visual check, was a package, 12 centimeters by 8 centimeters by 4 centimeters, weighing 340 grams, containing a passive radio frequency receiver, a miniaturized surveillance module with a 360-degree optical sensor operating in the near-infrared spectrum, a compressed data storage unit, and a transmission module capable of burst transmitting its collected data in a 0.3-second encrypted pulse on a frequency allocated to commercial weather monitoring satellites. The package was not a weapon. It was an eye that the catering vehicle carried through every security layer of the base, through the outer perimeter, through the secondary sensor ring, through the vehicle inspection checkpoint, and into the interior delivery area adjacent to the dining facility, and deposited, when the catering vehicle completed its delivery and departed, in a maintenance alcove beneath an exterior stairwell 23 meters from the base's primary communications relay building. The eye transmitted its first data burst at 1914, its second at 2133, its third at 2309, 8 minutes before the breach team entered the perimeter. Each burst contained 38 minutes of optical surveillance of the interior area around the communications relay building, guard patrol timing, camera coverage arcs, lighting patterns, the movement of maintenance personnel, and, critically, the 63-second window between 2247 and 2350. Each night, when the patrol route's 2 guard elements were simultaneously at their furthest separation point from the communications relay building's eastern approach. 63 seconds, every night, at the same time, because the patrol route had been designed to provide continuous coverage of the building's perimeter, but had been implemented with a route geometry that created a predictable gap at a predictable time due to the walking speeds of the 2 guard elements and the distance between their turnaround points. The breach team knew about the 63-second window at 2309. They entered the perimeter at 2317. The entry point was not a fence breach, not a tunnel, not a disguised vehicle. The breach team, 4 operatives carrying contractor identification documents whose biometric data had been enrolled in the base's access control database through a corruption operation targeting a local national base employee that Iran's intelligence service had been running for 7 months, entered through a pedestrian access gate on the base's eastern perimeter that processed civilian contractor personnel during the evening maintenance shift. The identification documents were genuine. The biometric data they carried, fingerprints, iris scans, matched the enrolled records in the database. The access control system processed all 4 entries as routine contractor admissions. The system logged them, timestamped them, and filed them in the access record that base security personnel review each morning. The access record will show, when security personnel review it tomorrow morning, that 4 contractor personnel entered the eastern pedestrian gate at 2317. It will also show that none of them exited. The breach team's first objective was not destruction. It was positioning. Between 2317 and 0.34, the first hour and 17 minutes inside the perimeter, the 4 operatives moved to pre-designated positions using route geometries derived from the surveillance package's optical data. They moved during the patrol gap windows. They used the base's own infrastructure, maintenance corridors, equipment storage alcoves, the underside of vehicle parking structures, to move between positions without crossing open ground during periods when patrol elements were within observation distance. They carried nothing that a random security check would identify as a weapon. Each operative carried a contractor tool bag containing equipment consistent with their documented contractor roles: electrical maintenance, HVAC servicing, communications, infrastructure repair. The actual functional items in those bags, the devices that would be deployed during the operation, were concealed within equipment housings that matched the electromagnetic signature, the physical profile, and the visual appearance of legitimate contractor tools to a standard that the base's physical security inspection protocols were not designed to distinguish. This is the operational concept that makes the breach blueprint universally applicable and universally dangerous. The detection systems at a $2 billion American airbase are calibrated to find weapons, guns, explosives, detonation devices, radio frequency emitters operating on military frequencies, materials with specific chemical signatures that explosive trace detection equipment is programmed to identify. Every item in the breach team's tool bags was designed to pass every one of those detection systems because none of them were weapons in any form that those detection systems were programmed to recognize. They were weapons in the form that the detection systems were not programmed to recognize. Precision-timed incendiary initiators embedded in the casings of what scanned as standard electrical junction boxes. Thermite-based cutting charges concealed within what scanned as standard HVAC duct section samples. A communications disruption device, a precisely calibrated electromagnetic pulse generator operating on a frequency and power level specifically calculated to disrupt the base's primary communications relay without triggering the electromagnetic anomaly detection systems that protect against conventional EMP attack, housed inside what scanned as a standard portable electrical testing unit. At 0034, the team reached its primary target, the flight line where 3 F-35A aircraft were parked in their designated maintenance positions, attended by a single overnight maintenance crew of 2 personnel who were, at that precise moment, in the maintenance facility building 70 meters from the aircraft, completing their shift paperwork. The incendiary initiators were placed in sequence. Each placement took between 40 seconds and 1 minute and 12 seconds, depending on the access complexity of the target attachment point. The initiators were not set to detonate immediately. They were set for a 60-minute delay, enough time for the team to complete all objectives and approach an exit window before the detonations triggered the base's emergency response and locked down all movement. At 0047, the team split. 2 operatives proceeded to the primary fuel storage facility, a hardened tank farm on the base's western perimeter, and deployed thermite cutting charges against the facility's primary outlet valve manifolds. Thermite burns at approximately 2,500 degrees Celsius and cannot be extinguished by conventional fire suppression systems. A thermite charge on a fuel valve manifold does not require the fuel to ignite to cause catastrophic damage. The thermite itself destroys the manifold, making controlled fuel delivery impossible and converting the tank farm from a fuel supply asset into an uncontrolled release risk that requires complete evacuation of the surrounding area before any remediation can begin. The other 2 operatives proceeded to the communications relay building. The relay building's exterior access, a standard commercial-grade door with a keypad entry system, was bypassed in 11 seconds using a device that the breach team's technical preparation cell had developed specifically for this model of keypad system, after obtaining the system's firmware version from a procurement database entry that an Iranian cyber operation had accessed 8 months earlier. Inside, the electromagnetic disruption device was positioned against the relay's primary transmission equipment housing and set for remote activation. At 0123, all 4 operatives were in their pre-designated exit positioning areas. At 0134, 60 minutes after the first incendiary initiator was placed, the flight line detonations began. 3 F-35A Lightning II aircraft, $82 million each, destroyed on the flight line, not by direct explosive attack, but by precision incendiary devices that ignited the aircraft's fuel systems from the inside, producing fires that the flight line's suppression systems were not fast enough to contain before the aircraft were beyond salvage. $246 million in airframe losses from devices that cost Iran's technical preparation cell an estimated $12,000 to fabricate. The primary fuel storage facility's valve manifold system, representing the base's entire controlled fuel delivery infrastructure for flight operations, rendered non-operational by thermite charges that burned for 4 minutes and 40 seconds, and destroyed equipment whose replacement requires specialized manufacturing with a 16-week lead time. For 16 weeks, this base cannot fuel aircraft from its primary storage system. It can receive emergency fuel delivery by tanker truck, a process that reduces its sustainable sortie rate by approximately 70%, and exposes the fuel supply chain to the additional vulnerability of road convoy operations in a threat environment that Episode 10 has already demonstrated Iran can exploit. The communications relay, disrupted by the electromagnetic pulse device for 11 minutes and 14 seconds, before base security personnel identified the disruption source and physically disconnected the affected equipment. 11 minutes of communications, Disruption at a military installation conducting active combat operations is not an inconvenience. It is a potential catastrophe. 11 minutes during which no communication was possible between the base's operations center and the aircraft it was managing, between the base's air defense systems and the command network coordinating their engagement authorities, and between the base commander and the theater command authority that authorizes responses to exactly the kind of ground security incident that was simultaneously unfolding inside the perimeter. But the communications disruption was not the most consequential thing the relay building visit produced, because while the electromagnetic device was being positioned, one of the two operatives used a direct connection data extraction tool, a device that physically interfaces with the relay equipment's maintenance port, to copy 34 gigabytes of data from the relay's traffic logging system. 34 gigabytes of encrypted military communications metadata. Not the content of the communications. The relay's encryption prevented content extraction, but the metadata. Timestamps, frequency assignments, unit identifiers, traffic volume patterns, routing protocols. Metadata that tells Iran's signals intelligence analysts which units communicate with which other units, at what times, at what traffic volumes, using what frequency assignments. Metadata that is, for a sophisticated signals intelligence operation, more valuable than content, because it maps the communications architecture of the entire base's operational network, allowing Iran to identify which communications nodes are highest priority, which frequency assignments carry the most critical traffic, and which disruption targets would have the most severe effect on the base's operational capability in a future strike. The Pentagon's classified damage assessment described the metadata extraction as the most significant single intelligence loss from a U.S. military installation since 1983. Not because of what Iran knows now. Because of what Iran can do with what it knows, in the context of everything, it has already demonstrated across 11 episodes that it is willing and able to do. The breach team's exit is the detail that transforms this operation from a damaging tactical event into a strategic revelation. All four operatives exited the base through the same eastern pedestrian gate they entered. They exited at 0340, 2 hours and 23 minutes after the flight line detonations triggered the base's emergency response, locked down all interior movement, and initiated a security sweep that should, by every protocol in the base's security plan, have identified and apprehended 4 individuals who had entered 4 hours earlier and not exited. They were not identified. They were not apprehended. They walked out. How? Because the security sweep, conducted under the emergency protocols activated by the flight line fires, the fuel facility incident, and the communications disruption occurring simultaneously, prioritized the threats it could see. The fires on the flight line, the fuel facility evacuation, the communications relay investigation. The sweep's human resources were allocated to the visible emergencies, and the access control database review that would have flagged the 4 non-exited contractor entries was scheduled as a follow-on action after the immediate emergencies were stabilized. The follow-on action was completed at 05 till 17. The database review flagged 4 contractor entries with no corresponding exits at 05:23. The eastern pedestrian gate's exit camera footage was pulled at 05:31. The footage showed 4 individuals exiting at 03:40. By 05:31, those individuals had been outside the base for 1 hour and 51 minutes. The gap between the emergency response's human resource allocation and the database review that should have caught the breach team is not a failure of this base's security personnel. Every decision made during the emergency response was rational, defensible, and consistent with the base's security protocols. Prioritize the visible threats, stabilize the immediate emergencies, conduct the administrative reviews when the situation is controlled. Iran designed the operation around exactly that priority sequence. The simultaneous detonations, fuel facility thermite charges, and communications disruption were not just damage objectives. They were distraction architecture, a deliberate sequence of visible emergencies engineered to consume the security response's human resources and attention during the window the breach team needed to exit. The operation was not designed to cause maximum physical damage. It was designed to cause sufficient damage to generate sufficient emergency response to provide the exit window. The $246 million in aircraft losses and the fuel facility damage were operationally necessary, not because Iran needed to destroy those specific assets, but because destroying them generated the emergency that covered the exit. The metadata extraction was the real objective. Everything else was the distraction that made it possible. Here is where geopolitics meets money moves from the specific to the universal, because the title's second clause is not rhetorical. The same blueprint works on every American military base currently operating in the Middle East, in Europe, in the Pacific, and in every other region where the United States maintains a forward military presence. Not because every base has the same security gaps, they do not. Each base has its own perimeter configuration, its own access control architecture, its own patrol patterns, its own contractor workforce, and its own specific operational rhythms that create its own specific gap between design security specification and operational reality. The blueprint works on every base because the blueprint is not about exploiting a specific gap. It is about a methodology for finding whatever gap exists and engineering an operation around it. And that methodology, the 11-day baseline mapping, the long-duration asset enrollment operation, the contractor cover identity development, the device fabrication calibrated to pass the specific detection systems deployed, the distraction architecture timed to the specific emergency response protocols, is replicable against any installation that shares the structural characteristics that make the methodology viable. Every American military base in the Middle East uses local national contractor labor. Every one of them has a gap between its design security specification and its operational reality driven by human factors. Every one of them has emergency response protocols that prioritize visible threats over administrative database reviews. Every one of them uses commercial-grade access control technology for contractor entry points that is vulnerable to the same firmware exploitation approach used on the communications relay building's keypad. Every one of them depends on contractor vehicle inspections conducted by guards who have processed the same vehicles on the same schedules for months or years. These are not failures of this base's security design. They are features of every large military installation that must balance security with the operational necessity of processing hundreds of contractor personnel and vehicles daily to function. You cannot run a $2 billion air installation without contractor support. You cannot provide contractor support without giving contractors access. You cannot give contractors access without creating the baseline familiarity that Iran's 11-day mapping operation turned into an operational plan. The Pentagon's response, announced in a press release at 11 hour Washington time, includes immediate implementation of randomized vehicle inspection protocols at all Middle East installations, suspension of local national contractor access pending review, acceleration of biometric enrollment verification procedures, and deployment of additional interior surveillance assets to create continuous optical coverage of high-value target areas. Each of these measures addresses a specific element of the breach blueprint. Each of them makes the next breach more difficult. None of them eliminate the structural vulnerability, the gap between designed security specification and operational reality, because that gap is not created by any specific security measure. It is created by the presence of human beings inside the security system, and it cannot be eliminated without eliminating the human beings, which means every American military base will always have a version of this gap. The gap's specific location and specific size will change as security measures evolve, but the gap will always exist. And a nation with Iran's demonstrated patience, 11 days of baseline mapping, 7 months of asset enrollment operations, 8 months of firmware intelligence preparation, has the operational methodology to find whatever version of the gap currently exists and build an operation around it. This is the blueprint's most dangerous quality. It is not a fixed plan. It is an adaptive methodology. And adaptive methodologies do not become obsolete when security measures change. They evolve. In previous episodes, Geopolitics Meets Money has tracked oil prices, carrier strike group costs, global shipping disruption, and IMF GDP projections. Episode 11's economic consequence is different in kind from all of them, because it does not operate through energy markets or shipping insurance or defense procurement cycles. It operates through the contractor economy that every American military base in the Middle East depends on to function. There are approximately 47,000 local national contractor personnel employed across American military installations in the Middle East theater. They perform functions that American military personnel cannot perform in sufficient numbers: facilities maintenance, food service, vehicle transport, construction, communications infrastructure support, and dozens of other categories of work that a modern military installation requires to operate at full capacity. Without local national contractor support, the operational capacity of every American base in the theater degrades within weeks. Not because of enemy action, but because of the simple arithmetic of the tasks that need to be performed and the American military personnel available to perform them. The Pentagon's suspension of local national contractor access, announced as an immediate security measure in response to the breach, is operationally necessary and operationally catastrophic simultaneously. Necessary because the breach demonstrates that local national contractor access is the attack vector. Catastrophic because suspending it removes the labor force that keeps the bases functioning. The economic consequence radiates outward from the bases into the host nation economies that depend on the contractor employment income. In Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, and Bahrain, the 4 nations hosting the American bases most directly affected, local national contractor employment at American installations represents a significant component of the semi-skilled labor market. Suspension of that employment does not just affect the contractors. It affects the families, the local businesses, the supply chains, and the tax revenues that flow from contractor employment income through the host nation economies. Host nation governments that have accepted the political cost of hosting American military installations in exchange for the economic benefit of the contractor employment relationship are now facing a situation in which the political cost, being designated as an Iranian military target, has increased dramatically while the economic benefit has been suspended. The stability of those basing agreements, which American military strategy in the Middle East depends on, is now a financial and political question for host nation governments facing populations who are asking whether the American military presence is worth its cost. Defense contractor stocks in the United States, the firms that manage American military base operations under government service contracts, fell between 8% and 14% at the open as investors priced in contract suspension, remediation costs, and the possibility that the Pentagon Security Review will result in restructured contractor access arrangements that reduce the revenue base of base operations contracts. DRS Technologies fell 11.2%. PAE Incorporated fell 13.7%. Vectrus fell 9.4%. The physical breach of a $2 billion installation, costing Iran an estimated $12,000 in device fabrication, plus the long-duration intelligence preparation costs, generated economic consequences across defense contractor equity markets, host nation labor markets, and American military operational capacity that dwarf the direct physical damage by orders of magnitude that have now become familiar across 11 episodes of this series. America's response to the breach was not military. It was institutional, and it was the most consequential institutional response of the entire series, because it targets the methodology rather than the outcome. The CIA, in coordination with the Defense Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency, activated what officials described in background briefings as a counterintelligence surge operation, targeting the contractor enrollment corruption network that Iran used to insert the breach team's biometric data into the base's access control database. The 7-month enrollment operation that prepared the breach required a corrupted insider, a base employee with database access, who enrolled fraudulent identities in exchange for payment. Finding that individual, and every other individual that Iran's intelligence service has similarly corrupted across the theater's 47,000-person contractor workforce, is the intelligence community's immediate priority. The NSA's signals intelligence operation, already monitoring Iranian intelligence communications following the IRGC targeting cell elimination in Episode 4 and the cyber key capture in Episode 9, identified communication patterns consistent with the breach team's exfiltration route within 6 hours of the Eastern Gate exit footage being reviewed. The patterns led to a safe house network in the host nation's capital city. 4 individuals matching the breach team's physical descriptions were detained by host nation security services in coordination with American intelligence at 09:34 local time, 6 hours after they had exited the base. The detention of the breach team is operationally significant. It is strategically insufficient. Because the breach team's detention does not recover the 34 gigabytes of communications metadata they extracted. It does not repair the 3 destroyed F-35As. It does not restore the fuel facility's valve manifold system on any timeline shorter than 16 weeks. And it does not address the structural vulnerability, the gap between security specification and operational reality, that the breach demonstrated exists across every American military installation in the theater. More consequentially, the breach team's detention does not eliminate the blueprint. 4 individuals are in custody. The methodology that guided them through a $2 billion installation security architecture in 4 hours and 23 minutes is documented, proven, and in the possession of every element of Iran's intelligence and military planning apparatus that was involved in developing it. Blueprints do not disappear when their first users are caught. They proliferate. And here is the dimension of Episode 11 that makes it the most strategically consequential episode in the series for audiences beyond the Middle East conflict specifically. Iran has now demonstrated, against a real $2 billion American military installation in operational conditions with verified results, a methodology for breaching military base security that does not depend on any capability unique to Iran. It does not require hypersonic missiles. It does not require satellite surveillance. It does not require a navy or an air force or any conventional military asset that a smaller, poorer, less capable adversary could not replicate. It requires patience, intelligence preparation, contractor workforce penetration, device fabrication calibrated to specific detection systems, and distraction architecture timed to specific emergency response protocols. Every one of those requirements is achievable by a non-state actor with sufficient funding, sufficient motivation, and sufficient time. Hezbollah has all 3. Hamas has demonstrated 2 of the 3 in previous operations. The Houthi movement, which coordinated the Eisenhower salvo in episode 10, has been studying American military base security in Yemen and Djibouti for a decade. Every Iranian proxy force that has been watching this series of 11 episodes unfold has just received a detailed operational case study in how to breach a $2 billion American military installation using resources and capabilities that they either already possess or can acquire. The Pentagon's classified damage assessment described the metadata extraction as the operation's most significant consequence. Geopolitics Meets Money respectfully disagrees. The metadata will degrade in intelligence value over time as the base changes its communications architecture in response to the breach. The blueprint does not degrade. The case study, a proven, operationally validated step-by-step demonstration that the gap between military base security specification and operational reality can be systematically mapped and exploited using a methodology available to any well-funded, patient, non-state actor. That is what Episode 11 has put into the world. And once it is in the world, it cannot be recalled. Here's the strategic question that 11 episodes of this series have been building toward, a question that is different in kind from every previous episode's outro, because it is not a question about what Iran did or what America will do in response. It is a question about what security means. Across 11 episodes, we have watched Iran defeat missile defense systems, runway protection, carrier strike group defensive architectures, nuclear deterrent signaling, and now the physical security of a $2 billion military installation. Each defeat has been achieved not by overwhelming the defense with superior force, but by finding the gap between how the defense was designed to work, and how it actually works when operated by human beings under real-world conditions. The missile defense gap, intercept probability against maneuvering hypersonic re-entry vehicles, the runway denial gap, the difference between rapid airfield repair doctrine and the absence of repair equipment, the carrier defense gap, engagement capacity against simultaneous multi-axis hypersonic salvos, the deterrence gap, 14 seconds of human hesitation inside nuclear command and control, the base security gap, the human familiarity that turns a checkpoint from a filter into a routine. Every gap is a human gap, not a technical failure, not an equipment limitation, a human gap, the irreducible difference between a security system's design performance and its actual performance. When human beings are operating it under the pressures, fatigue, resource constraints, and priority conflicts of real operational conditions. Iran has not found a way to defeat American military technology. It has found a way to defeat the human beings who operate American military technology. And that distinction matters enormously, because technology can be upgraded, replaced, and improved on a procurement cycle. Human beings cannot be upgraded. The gap between a security system's designed specification and its human-operated reality is not a problem that a $2 billion installation budget solves. It is a feature of every security system ever built, and it will remain a feature of every security system ever built because it is not a feature of the system. It is a feature of the species operating it. So here is the question for the GMM community after 11 episodes and the most comprehensive examination of asymmetric warfare, financial consequence, and strategic vulnerability that this channel has ever undertaken. Has Iran's 11-episode campaign demonstrated that American military power, the most technologically sophisticated, most expensively resourced, most extensively deployed military force in human history, has a vulnerability that no amount of spending, no technology upgrade, and no security protocol revision can eliminate? A vulnerability that exists not in the equipment, but in the human beings who operate it? Or does the adaptive capacity that America has demonstrated across 11 episodes, the B-21 reveal, the cyber key capture, the breach team detention, the institutional surge response, demonstrate that the gap between security specification and operational reality is a permanent feature of warfare that America has always managed better than its adversaries, and will continue to manage better, regardless of how sophisticated the adversary's exploitation methodology becomes? Drop your answer below, and share this series with anyone who thinks military power is primarily a question of hardware. Because 11 episodes have demonstrated, comprehensively and in detail, that it is primarily a question of the human beings who operate the hardware, the human beings who protect the installations, and the human beings who make the decisions when the tone plays in the National Military Command Center at 03:41 in the morning. This is Geopolitics Meets Money. Stay sharp.